I'm excited, kids. And here's why I'm excited. I'm excited because chapter 14 is actually my favorite chapter in the entire textbook. This is one of my favorite periods in U.S. history. So much stuff happens that you really can see how all the things that we've been discussing for the previous 13 chapters finally kind of blow up, and the Civil War is inevitable. Really, that's the best way to describe the Civil War. It is inevitable, and the events of the 1850s prove it. This chapter proves that the Civil War is going to happen no matter what. There's literally nothing anyone can do. All we're going to try to do is just postpone when the Civil War starts. And that's going to be what this chapter is all about. This chapter actually starts right at a perfect point. It's going to start with that big, crazy, horrible place, California. Perhaps you've heard of it. Let's dive right in. So, what did the United States look like in 1848 to 1850? This actually matters. The U.S. has 30 states by this time period, 15 free and 15 slave. 23 million citizens live in the United States, and there are 3.2 million slaves. And now, the problem is that the territory that we have acquired from Mexico from the Mexican-American War is now coming into question. What are we going to do with all of this land? Will it be free? Will it have slaves? That is going to be the big discussion that's going on in Congress. Everyone thought, oh, we're going to have a couple of years to worry about this. We don't have to solve this problem right away. And then we found gold in them thar hills out here in California. And California is going to screw up the entire balance because California wants to come into the Union as a free state. Well, crud. If it comes into as a free state, California's well the Mason-Dixon line. What is going to happen here? This is going to really screw everything up. So now we're going to have a big, long, crazy debate about what's going to be done with the state of California. Let's discuss that debate. So how do we even get here? Well, we have to make sure we understand this concept of sectionalism. Sectionalism, of course, says that there is a big difference between the North and the South. The economy, the culture, heck, even the language is completely different between the North and the South in the United States during this time period. North is an industrialized economy that does not need slavery. Okay, it industrializes because of the transportation revolution, as we discussed, which leads to an influx of immigrants working in factories. Okay, the South has a plantation-based economy, which needs to spread westward in order for slavery to grow, and for the Cotton Kingdom, the Cotton Empire, to grow as well. And of course, the West is going to be this big thing. It's our manifest destiny. We have to go here. And the West has resources that we can exploit to use to make even more money. We gotta go. There's no other option. Let's talk about the major opinions of important American political leaders. Our president during this time period is this dude named Zachary Taylor. You can see him pictured there. He is the current president of the United States, and of course, he is a slave owner. But what's interesting is that even though he's a slave owner, he actually really can't make up his mind on slavery. He knew that slavery was going to hurt the Union. So even though he is a slave owner, he's actually not a big fan of spreading slavery, as weird as it sounds. To make matters worse, the Whig Party cannot make up its mind upon slavery, which is actually what's going to lead to the downfall of the Whig Party and why, outside of an APUSH class, you've never heard of a Whig. So what are we going to do? We're going to turn to a man named Henry Clay. Yes, Henry Clay is still around. This dude just will not die. I was going to think of a funny joke, but nothing came to me. So, Henry Clay is going to come up in Congress and is basically going to come up with an idea on how to actually save the Union. He calls this solution the Great Compromise. The idea is we're going to bring California into the Union and we're going to find a way to do it. And just like all good compromises, it's going to make everybody a little happy, but mostly unhappy. What's his idea? His idea has 6 parts. Let's go over all 6, and we're going to discuss each one in a little bit of detail a little bit later. So, first, California is admitted as a free state. That's what California wants. California can do whatever the heck they want because they have gold and we are desperate for it. By the way, did you know California drew its own borders? You ever wonder why the eastern border of California is a straight line and then all of a sudden it gets all wiggly at the bottom? The straight line is the exact end of where all those mountains are. The mountains, of course, have the gold. And that squiggly line at the bottom, that's the Colorado River. Even in the 1850s, California knew we were going to have a water crisis eventually. So they made sure we tried to get all the water that we could. Something to think about. Okay, so number one, California, free state. Number two, we're going to split the Mexican cession into 2 states with no restrictions on slavery. The idea was, well, obviously one's going to be pro-slavery and one's going to be anti-slavery. Now, by the way, it's 1850. We still don't really know what this land actually looks like. I think had Henry Clay or anyone in Congress actually have gone to Arizona, Utah, or New Mexico, they would have been like, oh, yeah, no big deal. Slavery ain't going to happen here, and that would be the end of it. But of course, that's not what happens. Okay, number 3. We're going to settle the New Mexico-Texas boundary dispute in favor of Mexico. Basically, in favor of New Mexico. Basically what we're going to do here is Texas is too big, we're going to cut off a little chunk of Texas. Simple as that. Makes New Mexico happy. Why do we want to make New Mexico happy? I have no idea. Next, number 4. The federal government is going to assume all of the state debt of Texas. Remember, Texas was its own independent country. It had assumed a lot of debt. So what's going to happen here is the United States is going to take on all of the debt of Texas. That's going to make the property owners, hence the slave owners of Texas, very happy. We're actually going to keep slavery in Washington, D.C. That is right. The nation's capital had slavery legalized the entire length of the Civil War. And finally, number 6, we're going to have a more effective fugitive slave law. I will talk about that in a few minutes. That's a pretty good idea. There's enough stuff to make the free states happy, enough stuff to make the slave states happy. Everybody's happy. So why doesn't it pass? There's a pretty map. You can see what the idea here is going to be with the Compromise of 1850. So why doesn't it pass right away? Well, there's going to be a big, long discussion about what should be done. On the one hand, we have Henry Clay, this dude named Stephen Douglas. They're going to support this compromise. On the other hand, President Taylor refuses to compromise with the South in any way. This debate is going to be at a standstill for several months until President Taylor dies. I keep telling you guys, the best thing a president can do every now and then is just die, and it just seems to get rid of all this gridlock. Anyway, new president takes over. His name is Millard Fillmore. You never heard of him, never have to again, and that's fine. And he says, you know what? I'm going to let Congress decide whatever Congress says I'm going to do. So, here comes the Compromise of 1850. Now, this is where it gets complicated, because it really is the exact same idea that Henry Clay had, but with a couple of little adjustments. Clay's going to grow sick, and this dude named Stephen Douglas, he's pictured there, he's the little munchkin from the Lollipop Guild, he's going to take over. What he decides, because there's so much debate over this bill in Congress, and they're arguing with each other over so many things, he goes, I have an idea. Instead of making one big giant compromise, one big giant law, let's break this up into 6 individual components and vote on each one individually. That way, we don't have to have the entire compromise hinging on the idea of one, like if one state hates it, then the whole thing's going to crumble. Instead, let's break it up into 6 smaller parts. That way the people that agree with the part that they like can vote on it, and then it can get done. I know what you're thinking. Mullen, that just makes perfect logical sense. Why don't they just do that anyway and just not worry about, the one part of the law they don't like? That's what adults would do. Well, we're talking about Congress, kids. It's kind of the way this works. We're also going to add this idea of popular sovereignty added to the Compromise of 1850. What's popular sovereignty, you say? Well, popular sovereignty basically it means the people decide. So, the people that live in a territory should decide if the territory is free or slave. The people that live there decide whether slavery is going to exist there. It kind of blows up the whole idea of the Missouri Compromise and the Mason-Dixon line, doesn't it? Well, yeah, but that's actually important here. Popular sovereignty means that people that live there should decide. By the late summer of 1850, all parts of this compromise had passed. But was the compromise successful? Well, both sides are unhappy. That's how you actually know that this compromise is going to be good. The one thing that the states are really going to be, or the North is really going to be upset about, is this idea called the Fugitive Slave Act. Let's talk about this. The Fugitive Slave Law basically said that any former slave would be forcibly returned to the South if claimed by a white slave owner. These slaves had no right to a trial by jury, and they could not testify in court on their own behalf. Remember, slaves are not citizens. There's no statute of limitations. It doesn't matter how long a slave has been free. If they are said to be a slave, then they basically have to be returned. So there's no limitations. Slaves have no rights of citizens. Basically, any former slave, which essentially could mean basically any black person in the North, could be forcibly returned to the South if some Southerner just said, oh yeah, that was a slave I used to own a while ago. There really is no burden of proof here. Really, it's a white guy's word versus a guy that can't say anything else about it in court. Who do you think wins? To make it even more perverse, the court got a $10 fee if the slave was returned, but only a $5 fee if the slave wasn't. So it actually made more financial sense for the court, for their processing fees, to just return slaves to the South. Holy crap, right? I know, that's horrible. Welcome to America. The North is going to try to pass personal liberty laws in individual states, which is basically going to say that the South is going to have to come and get people if they're really going to try to do this. The North's not going to help. But really, this law was pretty heinous. In fact, one of the biggest things about this, what this Fugitive Slave Act basically proves to the United States, is that slavery is a issue that needs to be dealt with. We can't just sit back and wait for something to get better. This is a problem that really needs to be addressed fully and completely. What else helps bring the North specifically to understanding that slavery is wrong? Well, a very important book written by a very important woman is going to be written in 1852. The book is called Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. So, the premise of this book, it basically details the life of a southern plantation family and their slaves. Specifically, it's almost kind of, it's not necessarily told from the point of view of a slave, but essentially when you read this book, you are getting an idea of what southern aristocratic slave plantation owning life is really like. And it doesn't paint slavery in a very good light. It makes slavery seem pretty awful. Now, by the way, historical side note here, I'm recording this in 2015, and there was a film released about 2 years ago called 12 Years a Slave, also written about the plantation aristocracy in the South from the perspective of a slave. I personally believe that it is a much more captivating story, and it's a much better told story than Uncle Tom's Cabin. But the AP exam likes to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's the one I'm going to address. But if you really want to read a book about what slavery was really like in the South, 12 Years a Slave is a much better story and a much better book and much more, I guess, disgusting and shocking than Uncle Tom's Cabin. But anyway, this is the one the College Board wants you to know, so that's what I'm going to talk about. Here's why this book matters, and put a star next to this. This book helped convince Northerners that slavery was morally wrong. This is going to help turn public opinion against the South. Slavery is obviously morally wrong, as revealed by this book, and it's going to encourage Northerners to actively do something about this problem. All right, so the first event that we discussed was the Compromise of 1850. How do we bring California into the Union? Okay, that is what we have just seen. Look at this map here at the bottom. This is what the United States looked like. You can see free versus slave territories. This is what the United States looks like in about 1854. And our story right now is going to be about 1854. So, here's what's going down. We decide, and about once we realize that California has gold, we go, hey, you know what? We got to find a way to get that gold here quickly. How do we get the gold from California to the east coast of the United States? You know, where all the money is? Or take that back, where all the business and manufacturing and stock market is. How on earth do we get this gold from California all the way to the east coast? Well, we could sail all the way around, but that's about a 3 to 6 month journey going from New York and sailing all the way around the Atlantic and Pacific down to California. There's got to be a better way. Wait a minute, we've built railroads. Why don't we build a railroad across this country? And that way we can not only get to California quicker, we can get the gold out of California quicker. Perhaps you've heard of this railroad. It's called the Transcontinental Railroad. And if you're like me, you spent a good chunk of 4th grade, 5th grade, and 8th grade learning all about it. So since you already know everything, I'm not really going to discuss it. All you have to know is that a railroad is going to be built. But here's a good question. Which route should it take? Should it go through the north or should it go through the south? Because, as we know, wherever a railroad is built, cities, industry, and development soon follow. So if this railroad takes a northern route, the free states and the ideals of the free states and the money that comes from building a railroad is going to stay in the north. If this railroad takes a southerly route, the ideals and the south is going to become more economically viable and more economically structured. So which route will this railroad take? That's going to be a big debate in Congress. Well, obviously the North wants it to go through the North and the South wants it to go through the South. In fact, the South is so desperate to have it go through the South, we buy something. It's called the Gadsden Purchase. If you look back on the previous map, you'll realize that Arizona looks a little funky, like there's a big chunk of Arizona missing from what you guys see on a map. And when you look at a map today, you realize that Arizona has a straight boundary at the bottom of it. Where does that come from? That's the Gadsden Purchase. We basically buy a bunch of land from Mexico. I think it was like $30 million too. We spend a good chunk of money to basically buy a little bit of land in Arizona on the off chance we're going to build a railroad through there. That's the Gadsden Purchase. The real reason why I talk about that is there's a video I show in class, but I can't show it on this, so you learn something for no reason. Okay, so the bigger question is going to be here, wait a minute, what about this territory in the middle? This Kansas and Nebraska territory. Really, that is the last remnant of the Louisiana Purchase. And this region hasn't really been discussed in regards to anything. If you've been to Kansas and Nebraska, there's not much going on there. Like, there's 3 buildings and a cow in that area. So, obviously, there hasn't been a lot of discussion. But now that we might build a railroad, now that Americans are starting to move west, this is the new region we're concerned with. The year is 1854. In 1854, Stephen Douglas, yeah, the same guy, is going to introduce a new bill to Congress to organize the Nebraska Territory into 2 regions, the Nebraska and Kansas Territory. The idea here is that these regions are going to decide on slavery for themselves. The reason why we talk about Kansas and Nebraska is that this region is going to decide for itself if it's going to be slave or free. We know there's going to be 2 states. We know that we're going to have a Kansas state and a Nebraska state. The question is, are they going to be free or slave? Because now they get to decide. They get to decide if they're going to be free or slave. So what's going to happen? The idea is, like the thought that everyone had at the time, oh, this makes sense. We have 2 states. One's going to come in free, one's going to come in slave, and we're going to keep the same balance of power we've always had. That was the expectation that everybody had. But you'll see that when this is put to practice, it's going to get a little crazy. Or as you kids say, cray-cray. Or at least they did in 2012. Anyway, Congress really wants to build this Transcontinental Railroad. And the thing is, we're pretty sure that even if the railroad takes a northern or a southern route, it's going to have to probably go through Kansas and Nebraska. This is not a topographical map, so you can't see the mountains, but trust me, it just makes sense. If you're building a railroad, it's probably going through this region, even if it's going through the south. So, with that being said, these states are going to be really critical about whether they turn free or slave. It's going to be a very big, crazy debate. How big and crazy? Well, next slide. God, I love this picture. Okay, so here's what happens. Everyone that cares about this region being free or slave is going to rush to Kansas. Kansas is going to apply for statehood, and people are going to rush to Kansas to decide if it's going to become free or slave. The people that want it to be free are going to be called free soilers. That's easy. People who are going to want to keep slavery in this region are going to be called border ruffians. Now, let's talk about the kind of people that go here. These are not your calm, rational, well-spoken, reasonable individuals. These are the crazy people. The crazy people go here. Perhaps the violent people go here. This is not going to be a calm, rational discussion about, well, let's look at the soil moisture and look at the weather patterns and see if slavery or even cotton can even work here. Maybe it's not even going to be applicable to this region and we're just wasting all of our time. Oh no. Oh no. This is going to be a big, crazy, knockdown, drag-out, bloody, bloody fight. They're going to be kicking each other's butts the entire time over the possibility of this region being one way or the other. Because again, what's going to decide whether or not slavery exists here is going to be the people, not the weather, not the climate, not the necessity. It's going to flat out be the people of this region that are going to decide if there's going to be slavery or not. The South is going to launch the first volley in this little mini war. They write something called the Lecompton Constitution. You know, straight out of Lecompton. Sorry. Okay, so the Lecompton Constitution does not actually pass. It's never actually law, but here's what it says. The Lecompton Constitution says that no matter how the state votes, slavery is going to be legalized. Wait a minute. How is that like democratic? How is it even legal? If you're thinking that, good, because it's not. So this never actually is applied. But when the College Board likes to ask you about Bleeding Kansas, they like to ask you about the Lecompton Constitution. They like to throw you a curveball. Coincidentally, as I'm recording this, I'm watching an Angels game, and the guy just threw a curveball, and someone hit it for a home run, and the Angels are losing, so now I'm upset. Anyway, long story short, the Lecompton Constitution doesn't actually come in place, but it shows you how both sides of this fight are starting to play. Now, what about this picture? Who's that guy? This is a dude named John Brown. John Brown is what we call a radical abolitionist. Remember, an abolitionist is someone who doesn't like slavery, and when you hear the word radical, it's not the 1980s. When you hear the word radical, it means this person's probably not very normal or rational. John Brown takes it upon himself to go into this Kansas region and start shooting slave owners. You heard me right. That's exactly what he starts doing. He takes it upon himself to go shooting slave owners. Now, by the way, John Brown shows up again in this story very soon. Whenever you are tested about John Brown, it is always for the second time he's in this story. Okay? Just so you know. Whenever you see John Brown on a test, it's always for the second time he's in this story, not this one. The only reason why I bring him up right now is because, well, he was here and he was important. And two, I love this painting. I love this painting. It might be one of my favorite paintings in all of American history. So what ends up happening, basically a war is broken out in Kansas. You have these calm, perfectly rational, no, take that back. You have these psychopaths for the North and the South, both in this region trying to flood this region with votes. what's going to happen? Is Kansas going to become a free or a slave state? Every time a vote gets called for it, basically more and more people flood into this region. There's a story that one of the towns only had 300 people living in it, but over 30,000 votes were cast. So you can see that there might be some fraud involved here. Things are not going very well. And in fact, there's been a lot of murders, both of the Free Soilers and border ruffians in this region. Literally, like the Civil War basically broke out here. So it's getting a little bad. That's why we call it Bleeding Kansas. But it does get worse. Meanwhile, while this big crazy debate is breaking out in Kansas and there's a bunch of bloody fighting going on there, there's actually going to be some bloody fighting going on in Congress. The event is called Bleeding Sumner. In May of 1856, a Northern Republican named Charles Sumner is going to speak out about the growing injustice. He gets up in front of Congress and goes, "Yo, guys, this is our job. It's our job to decide these things, not to just allow the citizens go and murder each other over it. We should be the ones that decide. Besides, doesn't this prove just how crazy slavery is if people are willing to murder each other over the fact that it needs to continue to exist? What is wrong with us? We got to get rid of it." Now, as he's giving his big long speech about getting rid of slavery, he basically says something mean to this dude named Andrew Butler. Andrew Butler is from South Carolina. Andrew Butler is a big Confederate, or I shouldn't say Confederate yet. He's a big slave owner. And Charles Sumner is going to basically make fun of him. As soon as he does that, Andrew Butler's friend gets up. His name is Preston Brooks. He gets up and starts smacking Charles Sumner over the head with a cane in Congress. And everyone just stands there and watches. I believe like over 25 different, 25 hits to the head. Charles Sumner is hit in the head 25 times by Preston Brooks. In fact, Preston Brooks only stops when his cane breaks. Charles Sumner is left there as a bloody mess on the floor, and Congress just goes, "All right, might be time to just retire for the day." That's where this political cartoon comes from. It says Southern chivalry. Now, when you hear about the South, you hear about how warm and hospitable, whatever, and nice they are. This political cartoon is showing you what the South is really like. The South are violent and they are desperate to keep slavery. You can see how rational Charles Sumner looks as he's on the ground, and you can see Preston Brooks being violent and smacking him in the head with a cane. That's essentially what you're seeing here. That's this political cartoon is showing. It's showing that the South is essentially pretty messed up. Things are escalating about this whole idea, and obviously the supporters from either side, both the abolitionists, are getting a little crazy. Speaking of, whatever happens to Kansas, Kansas actually does enter the Union as a free state in 1861, but for now, its fate is completely up in the balance. The biggest victim of this time period is actually going to be the Whig Party. Remember them? Yeah, they basically die out in the 1850s because the Whigs can't make up their mind about slavery. And out of the dead, burning ashes of the Whig Party is going to rise a new party. Like a phoenix rising out of the ashes. We're going to have a new political party that's going to form. They're called the Republican Party. And this is the Republican Party that you guys know and talk about to this day. This is where they come from. They basically sprout out in the 1850s, and they really have one clear message. They don't like the expansion of slavery. I'm going to say that again. They don't like the expansion of slavery. Did I say they wanted to get rid of slavery? No, not at the time. The Republican Party of the 1850s starts out by saying they don't like the expansion of slavery westward. The Republican Party recognizes the fact that slavery might need to exist in the South. And if you look at it from an economic standpoint, slavery probably does need to exist in the South. The United States makes a lot of money off of the selling of cotton. We make a lot of money off of slavery. I know it's a horrible statement to say, but it is entirely true. So if you take out the moral aspects and obviously how horrible slavery is, which by the way, most Northerners didn't know how bad it really was, from From an economic standpoint, it's necessary. The Republican Party of the 1850s recognizes this. They don't want slavery to expand, but they recognize its legal right to exist. I know that sounds like a horrible statement, but sometimes history can be. Anyway, um, the reason why the Republican Party is important is because they're going to latch on to this growing sentiment in the North. The North is starting to realize that they don't like the expansion of slavery and that things are getting a little crazy out west over this idea of slavery. So when this new political party comes forward and says, you know what, slavery shouldn't expand, a lot of Northerners are going to say, thank you, finally someone agrees with me, and now this is a party I can vote for. The Republican Party is going to become pretty popular in the North because, and even out west, because it's going to make this statement that a lot of Americans agree with. That they make a statement that the Whig Party never did. The Whig Party never came out and said they don't like slavery. The Republican Party is going to come out and be bold-faced and say, you know what? Slavery can't expand. We're not a fan of it. Which leads us to the election of 1856. To be honest, the only reason why I talk about it is because this dude named John Fremont is going to run for the Republican Party. If you don't know who John Fremont is, you must not be living in California, because obviously you've all been to Fremont Street. No? Okay, well, John Fremont is going to be the first Republican to run for president. Who was he? He was the first governor of California. That's why you as Californians should all know that. Students in Southern California listening to this. Anyway, that's the only reason why I talk about this election. The guy that wins is a dude named James Buchanan. We'll talk about him more in class. James Buchanan is a Democrat. And basically, to me, James Buchanan goes down as one of the worst presidents in all of U.S. history. The reason why is that he doesn't get involved in what's going to happen next at all. He doesn't make any statements about it. He doesn't assert any authority as president. He lets the next couple of events happen and just say, well, that's just kind of how things are going to go. He wasn't really a leader, which is really unfortunate because this is the time period that America needs a leader the most, and James Buchanan does nothing. It's a big reason why he goes down as one of our worst presidents. Don't believe me? Let's keep telling the story. I want you guys to put 15 stars on your paper next to this case. We're going to talk about it in class, and we're going to look at some documents about this. This is the most important Supreme Court case of, I don't want to say the entire 1800s, but it's close. This Supreme Court case is super, super duper important. Let's tell the story. Dred Scott is a slave. He was born a slave, and he's a slave that's going to be taken to the north by his master. He's going to be taken to the territory of Illinois. Illinois is a free territory, and it's also north of the Missouri Compromise line. Dred Scott is going to get married in Illinois, which seems strange because it wasn't really common for slaves to be legally married at this time period, but he was. Anyway, he goes to the north. He has children in the north. So, Dred Scott, born a slave, lived in the south. He's going to be taken by his master to the north and moved up into the north. And he's going to get married and he's going to have kids. Dred Scott has a question, though. Wait a minute. I was born a slave. I have children that are somehow still presumably slaves, even though we live in the north now. Can a slave still be a slave if they live in a free territory? Ooh, that's a good question. Can a slave still be considered a slave if they're taken to the north? Interesting. In 1846, Scott's going to sue for his freedom, and it's going to take a very long time, but eventually in 1857, this case makes its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And now the Supreme Court's going to decide. Remember, court cases start small, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, this case makes its way to the Supreme Court, and now the Supreme Court's going to decide, well, if a slave is taken to the north, is that slave still a slave? The Supreme Court at this time period is very heavily Southern leaning. things do not look good for Dred Scott as this case is being heard. The Chief Justice at this time period, he's a guy named Roger Taney. He was a former slave owner. So that's not good. We'll read the case brief in class, but as a summary of what Roger Taney said, the first part of his decision says, the founding fathers had no intention of granting citizenship to slaves. So, with that in mind, Dred Scott has no legal right to even sue in a federal court. The very first thing that Roger Taney says is that, you know what? You're a slave. Slaves don't have rights in this country. The Supreme Court should not even be listening to you talk to us right now. This is not even our concern. You are not a citizen. Ouch. Here comes part two. The second thing that Roger Taney says, he goes, okay, even though you're not a citizen and I'm just wasting my time here, let me go ahead and tell you how this case is going to be decided. Slaves are property. If you move your property from one state to another, that property is still property. If you take your dresser that you have all your clothes in from Louisiana and then take that dresser to Maine, is it not still your dresser? Is it not still your property? It is still your dresser. It is still property. So, as slaves are defined as property for the South, if a slave is taken to the North, that slave is still a slave. The Dred Scott case basically says, here's the shortest summary I can give you, a slave is a slave anywhere. Whoa. This Supreme Court case is so vital because it basically says slavery can go anywhere uninhibited. And there's nothing the North can do about it. The Supreme Court is the final law and rule in this country unless there's a change to the Constitution. And now the Supreme Court has said slavery can go wherever the heck it wants. The North is horrified. Slavery can go anywhere. Things are bad. Whatever happened to poor Dred Scott? Scott and his family are going to be returned to slavery. Oh, but there is a silver lining to this story. Scott's slave master, is going to die, and in his will, he grants the slaves to his widow. The widow is going to marry someone, is going to be remarried, and she marries someone who is an abolitionist. So, Scott, shortly after this case that says you're a slave again forever, is going to actually end up being freed. Good for him. Excellent. It's a great story, right? Unfortunately, Dred Scott dies of tuberculosis shortly thereafter. I know. It's a sad story. It's the story of Dred Scott. But again, what matters? I'll say it again. According to the Supreme Court, a slave is a slave anywhere. The year is now 1858, and it is time for a new character to enter the story. You'll see him there on the left-hand side. That is an unshaven Abraham Lincoln. Looks a little bit different than most of the pictures you see of him, but that is Abraham Lincoln there on the left. Now, the year is 1858, and Abraham Lincoln is going to run for a Senate seat in the state of Illinois. Again, this is not him going for president just yet. He's basically a politically unknown person, but he's going to run for a Senate seat in Illinois. His opponent is going to be the popular person we've talked about several times so far. That's right, the little munchkin, Stephen Douglas. These guys could not be more polar opposites. Lincoln is 6'4". He's tall and lean. He's a self-educated lawyer who was raised on the frontier. He opposed the expansion of slavery. He didn't like the Mexican-American War, and he did not like the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He also had a really high nasally voice, according to most historians. Douglas, his opponent, is short and stout. Here is his handle, here is his spout. He's about 5'4". He's a popular politician of this time period. In fact, he's the most famous Democrat alive at this time period. He's going to support popular sovereignty and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Essentially, what this random seat in the Senate from a state called Illinois, what this Senate race did was basically show the two different political philosophies of this time period. Lincoln is going to be a Republican, and he's going to argue and really help build the Republican philosophy of this time period. And Stephen Douglas is the leading Democrat of this time period. So basically, what these debates become when they're trying to fight for a Senate seat, what these debates become are the philosophies of essentially the Republicans and the Democrats leading into the Civil War. Almost, you could say, that these debates are going to be the discussions of the North and the South leading into the Civil War. Here's what I mean. Lincoln is going to be anti-expansion of slavery. I want to make this very clear. Lincoln says many times that he is not necessarily anti-slavery, he's anti the expansion of slavery, which at this time period is essentially going to be the platform of the Republican Party. A lot of people misspeak when they say the Republican Party was solely anti-slavery. That is not the case. The Republican Party at this time period is anti-expansion of slavery, at least for now. That doesn't mean people inside the party weren't totally against slavery, obviously. I'm just trying to say, in general, this is what the party believed. Douglas, on the other hand, is going to be a Democrat. It's not so much that Douglas was like completely pro-South or anything, but he really wanted to let the people decide. He really wanted to let people decide about slavery. It wasn't the fact that Douglas owned millions of slaves or anything. It's just more the fact that he thought that the people should decide, and if they chose slavery, so be it. Lincoln's going to argue that slavery shouldn't expand. Douglas is going to argue that slavery can. It's all based on your definition of popular sovereignty. So they get into this big long debate, and during this debate, this idea called the Freeport Doctrine is going to be introduced. Lincoln is going to ask Douglas to explain if people in a territory could lawfully exclude slavery. He wanted Douglas to explain how popular sovereignty could still exist in the wake of the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision says a slave can go anywhere if a slave owner wants it. So Lincoln's going to say, okay, if that's the case, does popular sovereignty still exist? You know, that thing you created, like your baby, does that still exist in wake of Dred Scott? Douglas is going to give a pretty long, drawn-out answer, but essentially Douglas says that individual regions of the country are going to have to decide if they want to enforce slavery laws or not, regardless of what the Supreme Court says. Whoa. So people can just kind of do whatever they want and expect the Supreme Court to take care of things? It was a pretty big deal at the time. It seems kind of silly now. It was a pretty big deal at the time for Douglas to say this. Douglas is going to salvage the popular sovereignty argument, but he's going to really kind of upset the South and the North by doing so. So really, Stephen Douglas kind of ruined his political capital by trying to save popular sovereignty. Douglas is going to win the Senate seat, but he hurts any future chance of ever becoming president. But Lincoln, on the other hand, is going to look like a really, really smart, well-educated, which is silly because he doesn't have much of an education at all, but he's going to look like a really smart, well-spoken, really good candidate for this new Republican Party. And the Republican Party is going to gain a lot of attention. Meanwhile, history keeps marching on. The year is now 1859. And whenever you hear the name John Brown, this is the event that they're asking you about. They don't ask you very often about John Brown being involved in the Kansas or Bleeding Kansas, but when they talk about John Brown, they're talking about Harper's Ferry. By the way, that painting there on the left is another one of my favorite paintings in American history. John Brown is in my two favorite paintings in all of American history. Anyway, the year is now 1859, and John Brown is going to be a fierce abolitionist. Essentially, he's going to say that he received a message from God that basically told him he needs to single-handedly end slavery. Here's his plan. His plan is to take over a federal armory. So what that means, basically, there were areas of the country that the U.S. government stockpiled weapons. And if a war were to break out, or if they were needed, people could go and get these weapons and help fight. That's essentially what the government used to do. They kind of still do that now, but now we have more military bases. We didn't really have military bases back then. We had federal armories. So, John Brown's plan. He's going to go and take a bunch of slaves, have them run off their plantations. He's going to give all these slaves a bunch of weapons that he's just taken from Harper's Ferry, which, by the way, is a federal armory. He's going to give these slaves guns and have the slaves go and shoot all their masters and basically have a insurrection across the South of slaves shooting their former masters. Unfortunately, he starts off this plan and he actually does capture the federal armory. But unfortunately, he neglected to tell the slaves of his plan. So he's sitting there with a stockpile of guns, basically with him and his kids, with a stockpile of guns, waiting for the slaves to show up so he could start a big giant insurrection. And they don't. Oops. John Brown's going to be arrested and he's going to be tried for treason by the state of Virginia. And he's going to be hanged without much of a trial 2 months later. What are the results of this? Why do we talk about this? Well, the word I want to teach you guys right now is the word martyr. The North is going to see John Brown as a martyr, which means a martyr basically implies that it's almost like someone who does something crazy and radical, and because of what that person did, or more importantly, because of that person's death, the rest of the country responds. So John Brown is going to be a little crazy. Let's not split hairs here. He's going to be a little crazy, but the rest of the country is going to say, you know what? Wow, we got to do something about this. You'll see this happen a lot. If you watch the news a lot, you'll see this happen. Um, it's unfortunate, but there'll be stories of somebody getting shot or somebody getting stabbed or some. Usually, martyrs usually involve violence, um, but that's usually what that implies. It implies that well, this person died for what they believed in, so we should kind of be better. Another example would be the story of Christianity. That Jesus Christ um, died, and because of that, his followers decided they have to lead better lives. That's what a martyr is. So John Brown's going to die, and it's going to encourage the North that really something drastically needs to be done about this whole Civil War slavery thing that's brewing. The year is now 1860. We're getting there, kids. It's almost Civil War time. The year is now 1860. The problem is, this country is broken up into very many distinct regions. Remember that whole idea of sectionalism? Well, now it's going to become a major problem because each section of the country, north, south, and west, are going to select their own candidates for this election. The north is going to pick this dude, perhaps you've heard of him. I shouldn't say the north. Scratch that. The Republicans are going to select this dude, perhaps you've heard of him. His name is Abraham Lincoln. But the South, or really the Democrats here, can't make up their mind about who they want. The Democrats are going to be a split party. It's not so much that the Democratic Party says that they support slavery, but they kind of support people's right to choose on this. So Democrats in the North are going to say, okay, well, we choose that we don't like it. So we want a candidate that doesn't like slavery. Democrats in the South are going to say, well, we want a candidate that does support slavery. Basically, what ends up happening here is that the Republicans pick one candidate and the Democrats pick two. Republicans pick Abraham Lincoln. The Democrats are going to pick Stephen Douglas and another guy named John Breckinridge, and they're all going to run for the presidency. Essentially, what happens here is going to be multiple candidates running from the same party. As I've discussed in class, that never works. Americans had a relatively clear choice. Lincoln was a moderate, and he was the only non-Southern candidate, and said that the South had a right to preserve slavery. Lincoln says, there is no legal way the North can take away slavery from the South as the law is written right now. According to the Constitution, there is nothing the North can do except for change the Constitution in regards to slavery. Lincoln even says, I am not legally able to, nor am I inclined to get rid of slavery in this country. Lincoln's going to win the Electoral College, 180 to 123. But Lincoln was so unpopular in the South that his name did not appear on over 10 ballots in southern states. In fact, Abraham Lincoln got 0 votes in the South. According to historians, no one even wrote his name in on a southern ballot. He's going to win the presidency with only 39% of the popular vote. but he becomes the president, and the South is going to be a little upset that they lost. They had technically four candidates running that were supposed to represent the South, and the South still somehow lost this election. The South is going to feel that Abraham Lincoln stole this election and that because Abraham Lincoln is president, he's going to take away all of their slaves and the entire Southern way of life. This is not the only, but one of the major downsides of sectionalism. If your side doesn't win, you decide you don't want to play. Unfortunately, the South decides that they don't want to play anymore, and they are going to basically say, you know what, our guy didn't win, so we're out. What do I mean? Well, because of Lincoln winning this election, the South secedes from the Union. Now, what does this mean? Well, the election happens in November, and the election results are going to be certified by Congress in December. But Abraham Lincoln doesn't become president officially until April. So from the election day until Lincoln becomes president, there's a good 4.5, about 5 months of time that passes. And after the election, now by the way, elections were really slow back then. It's not like now when CNN gives us instantaneous updates on every state. It actually took about 4 weeks after the election for people to realize that Lincoln had won. And according to the Constitution, once the president is certified by the Electoral College and Congress, they still have to wait for Congress to come back in session, which is usually at the end of winter, which is usually in April. So, long story short, Lincoln wins this election. He's announced as the next president in December, but he doesn't get to actually do anything until the middle of April. So Lincoln knows that he is president, but can't do anything about it. Meanwhile, the southern states are going to react to the announcement that Abraham Lincoln won and the South essentially lost this election. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina votes to secede from the Union. Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas soon follow. On April 4th, 1861, the Confederate States of America are going to be established, and they name a president, Jefferson Davis. What does the South believe? Well, if you read the Southern Constitution, it says that they support states' rights, they uphold slavery. The Southern Constitution even implies that abolition is illegal, and they call themselves God's most favored region. So if you notice, the Deep South is the first area to secede. I'll pause for a second to let you try to think of why. Oh, right. The Deep South isn't really connected to the North geographically. In fact, there's a big barrier between the Deep South and the North. You'll notice it. It's basically these Upper South or these Middle states. But what happens here? The Upper South, by which of course I mean Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, they're going to be very economically dependent on the North, unlike the Lower South. The Upper South is going to be basically less reliant on slavery. Example, the western half of Virginia actually has no slaves, so they don't really want to leave. Plus, Virginia isn't stupid. If Virginia secedes, where do you think the fighting is going to take place between the North and the South? If there's going to be a fight between the North and the South, it's going to take place in Virginia. I'll give you guys some statistics later, but a huge majority of the fights of the Civil War take place in Virginia. So Virginia is very reluctant to secede. What does compel the rest of the South to leave? It's actually the first battle of the Civil War that's going to compel the Upper South to leave. Fort Sumter, which is near Charleston, South Carolina, is basically going to be a Union fort. The Union's going to have some supplies that are going to be at this fort, and the federal troops, or the Union troops, the names are the same, are basically going to be blockaded by South Carolina. The state of South Carolina does not allow any Union ships into this harbor to help resupply this fort, and the soldiers inside are starving. Lincoln informs the governor of South Carolina that he does not want to fight, but he wants to give food to his soldiers. And Lincoln basically says, look, I'm sending ships in there. They only have food. Do not attack them. They are only there to give food. That way these guys don't starve. Let's talk out this issue. Come on, let's stop being crazy. Let's talk out this issue. Well, before Lincoln could even get a ship there to help resupply these men, the Confederacy essentially decides to start shooting on this fort. In response to this, Lincoln's going to send out a message asking the rest of the country for help to help these soldiers that are being attacked by the evil Confederacy. Because Lincoln says that, the Upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee, all decide to secede. Robert E. Lee resigns from the Union Army in disgust, and the Civil War has now officially begun. It is now 1861. It's time for the Civil War. Before I tell this story, I want to make something abundantly clear. Lincoln never meets with a Confederate delegation. If you read Lincoln's speeches, he never refers to the South as an actual country. He always calls them the states in rebellion. That's actually going to be a very important point. Lincoln's going to argue that the South never existed because the Constitution doesn't allow people to leave. Lincoln's going to argue that everything he does in this war is completely legally justified because he's not fighting another country. He's bringing his own country back together. We'll discuss that in more detail in the next chapter. I hope you guys enjoyed this chapter. I hope you guys saw how a lot of the things we've been talking about the entire year so far have finally come to a head, and now the Civil War has officially begun. But unfortunately for you guys, you still got to wait till the next chapter to actually start learning about it. See you then.